The air in the steaming cup diner always felt the same, thick, a little greasy, and heavy with the promise of a cheap hot meal. It was a smell that clung to your clothes, a mixture of brewing coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla syrup they used for the milkshakes. For Clara, it was the smell of her life. A constant backdrop to the long hours she spent weaving between the worn-out tables and cracked vinyl booths. She moved with a kind of practiced efficiency, her feet knowing the exact path to avoid a wobbly table leg or a child's dropped toy. Her smile was a mask she put on every morning, a little brittle around the edges, but it did the job. It made people feel seen for a moment before they went back to their lives, and their tips, if they were good, helped her pay the rent for a small apartment that felt just as tired as she did. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the usual calm of the diner, broken only by the clatter of plates and the low hum of quiet conversations, was shattered. A group of men had pushed 2 tables together in the corner, the ones with the best view of the street. They were loud, their laughter booming and echoing off the faded posters of milkshakes and burgers that lined the walls. Their suits looked expensive, the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle, even when they slouched in their seats. They were a splash of vibrant, disruptive color in the otherwise muted tones of the diner. Clara watched them from the corner of her eye as she refilled the sugar dispensers. They were from a different world, a world of sharp lines and clean edges. A world that didn't have room for sticky tabletops or the smell of old frying oil. The leader of the group was a man named Alistair, had a voice that carried, laced with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He held his coffee cup as if it were a delicate piece of art, his pinky finger slightly raised. His eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the diner not with curiosity, but with a kind of critical judgment, like a king surveying his peasant village. He was telling a story, and his friends were hanging on his every word, laughing at all the right moments. Clara felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She had served men like him before. They saw her as part of the furniture, a function, not a person. They were the kind of people who would complain about a tiny speck on their fork and then leave a messy table without a second thought as she approached their table to take their order. Alistair's gaze swept past her and landed on something across the room. Tucked away in a far corner, almost hidden by a large potted ficus tree that was losing a fight with dust, was an old upright piano. It was a dark wood monster, its surface scarred with scratches and water rings. A few of the ivory keys were chipped, and it looked as though it hadn't been played in years. It was just a piece of decoration now, a silent sentinel holding up a dusty "Please wait to be seated" sign. A slow, condescending smile spread across Alistair's face. He gestured toward the piano with his coffee cup. "Now, there's a relic," he said, his voice loud enough for half the diner to hear. "I bet that thing hasn't produced a decent tune since the 50s. It's probably just for show, like the plastic fruit in the bowl on the counter." His friends chuckled, their eyes following his. The diner grew quieter as other patrons began to listen, the atmosphere shifting from relaxed to tense. Clara stood by their table, her order pad in hand, feeling a hot flush of anger creep up her neck. She knew that piano. She knew every scratch and every faded key. It had been her grandmother's, a gift to the diner's original owner, decades ago. It had once been the heart of this place, filled with music on Saturday nights. Now, it was just a joke for a rich man who didn't belong here. Alistair continued, leaning back in his booth and draping an arm over the back. "I bet you couldn't find a single person in this whole establishment who could play more than chopsticks on that old box without causing a catastrophe." He looked around the room, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of his own cleverness. He was enjoying the attention, the power he held in that moment. "In fact," he said, his voice rising even more, "I'll make it interesting. I'll give $500. Cash, right here, right now, to anyone who can sit down and play one full song. A real song. Something that doesn't sound like a cat falling down the stairs." He pulled a thick wallet from his inner jacket pocket and fanned out a collection of $100 bills. The sight of the money was a shock of green in the Bajan Brown diner. A murmur went through the few customers. Some looked intrigued, others looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting between Alistair and the piano. It was a dare born of cruelty, a public spectacle designed to mock and humiliate. Alistair's eyes scanned the room, looking for a victim. They passed over an old man nursing a cup of tea, a young couple sharing a plate of fries. And then they landed on Clara. She was still standing by their table, her pen frozen over her pad. She felt his gaze like a physical touch, heavy and unwelcome. "How about you, dear?" he asked, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "You look like you have hidden depths. A quiet girl like you, probably a secret concert pianist, am I right?" His friends erupted in laughter. The entire diner was silent now, every eye on her. She could feel their stares, a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Her face felt like it was on fire. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She just shook her head, unable to speak, and turned to walk away, her hands trembling slightly. Wait, don't be shy," Alistair called after her. $500? That's more than you make in a week, I bet. Just for a little song." The words were meant to be an incentive, but they felt like a slap in the face. He was right, and that made it even worse. He was reducing her entire life, her struggles, her quiet existence, to a number. He was putting a price on her dignity. Clara kept walking, heading back toward the safety of the kitchen. She could feel the tears pricking at the back of her eyes. She was just a waitress. That's all he saw. It's all anyone saw. But as she reached the counter, she caught the eye of George, an older gentleman who came in every day for the same thing, a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He was sitting on his usual stool, his hands wrapped around his warm mug. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his eyes kind and understanding, and gave her a small, slow nod. It wasn't a nod that told her to do it. It was a nod that said, "I see you. You're more than what he thinks you are." Something in that simple gesture shifted inside her. The anger and shame were still there, but a new feeling began to bubble up, a tiny spark of defiance. She was so tired of being invisible, of being looked down upon, of being treated like she was nothing. Maybe this was her chance to show them. Not for the money, not for him, but for herself. For the little girl who used to spend hours at that very piano, her small fingers flying across the keys while her grandmother baked pies in the kitchen. For the teenager who dreamed of concert halls, a dream that had faded with time and responsibility. With a quiet sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, Clara placed her order pad on the counter. The whole room was watching her, the silence so thick she could hear the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She turned and began to walk slowly at first, then with a more determined stride, toward the dusty old piano in the corner. Each step felt like a mile. Alistair's smirk had returned, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't actually expected her to do it. As she reached the piano, she ran her hand lightly over its scratched surface, a wave of memories washing over her. She sat down on the creaky wooden bench, the familiar feel of it grounding her. The diner watched, holding its collective breath as she placed her fingers on the yellowed keys. Her entire posture changed. The slump in her shoulders disappeared. Her back straightened, and her hands, which had been wiping tables just moments ago, hovered over the keys with an unexpected grace and familiarity. The quiet waitress was gone, and in her place sat a musician. The silence that fell over the steaming cup was a heavy blanket, smothering the usual clatter and chatter. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with the weight of a dare hanging in the greasy air. Every eye in the diner was fixed on Clara. She could feel their gazes like a physical pressure, 1,000 tiny pinpricks on her skin. Her feet felt like they were stuck in cement, each step a monumental effort as she moved away from the relative safety of the counter, and toward the dusty corner where the old piano waited. The world seemed to slow down. She could see the cracked linoleum tiles on the floor, each one a milestone on this humiliating journey. She could see a half-eaten plate of fries, the ketchup congealing, a forgotten meal in a forgotten moment. Everything was in sharp, painful focus. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. A part of her, the part that had been a waitress for too many years, was screaming at her to turn back. "Just walk away," it said. "Go into the kitchen, tell the cook you feel sick, and disappear. It's not worth it. He's just a rich bully, trying to feel big by making someone else feel small." This voice was loud and sensible. It was the voice of survival, the one that had gotten her through countless hard days and lonely nights. It was the voice that told her to keep her head down, do her job, and don't make waves. But another voice, a much quieter one, a voice she hadn't heard in a very long time, was whispering something different. It was a voice from her past, from a time when her hands knew the feel of piano keys better than they knew the feel of a damp dish rag. It was the voice of the girl who would close her eyes and let the music carry her away to another world, a world where she was not just a quiet girl from a small town, but someone with a gift, someone who could create beauty out of thin air. This voice was faint, almost drowned out by the roar of her own anxiety, but it was there, and it was telling her to sit down. She risked a quick glance at Alistair's table. He was leaning back, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He was enjoying this. He was the director of this little drama, and she was his unwilling star. He expected her to fail. He was waiting for the moment of awkward silence, the fumbled notes, the laughter from his friends that would confirm his belief that people like her, people from this world, had no real talent, no depth. He saw her as a prop in his story, a way to impress his friends with his $500 and his cruel wit. The anger that had been simmering in her stomach began to boil again. It was a hot, clean feeling cutting through the fog of her fear. Who was he to judge her? Who was he to put a price on her dignity, on her past, on the memories that were tied up in that old, dusty piano? Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the other patrons. There was the young couple, holding hands under the table, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity. There was the truck driver in the booth by the window, his fork halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with anticipation. And then there was George, the old man at the counter. He hadn't moved. He was still watching her, his expression unchanged. It wasn't a look of pity or excitement. It was a look of quiet faith. It was the look a teacher gives a student who is about to take a test they've studied for 4 years. It was a look that said, "You know how to do this. Just trust yourself." That look was her anchor. It was the one thing in the room that wasn't about Alistair's dare, or the money, or the spectacle. It was just about her. In that moment, she realized this wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. It was about the girl who used to dream in melodies. It was about the grandmother who had saved for months to buy that very piano, who had sat beside her on that creaky bench, her patient hands guiding Clara's small fingers over the keys. "Feel the music. Don't just play the notes," she used to say. "Let it live inside you." Finally, she reached the piano. It stood there like a forgotten friend, its dark wood scarred and dusty. She could see the faint outlines of where picture frames or vases had once sat. She ran a hand lightly over the top, her fingers tracing the familiar scratches. One of them was from the time she'd knocked over a glass of lemonade while trying to play. It's a difficult piece from a book that was too advanced for her. Her grandmother hadn't been angry. She had just wiped it up with a smile and told her that even the best musicians make mistakes. The memory was so vivid, so real, that for a second, she could almost smell the lemonade and the scent of her grandmother's lavender perfume. She could feel Alistair's eyes on her, burning into her back. She could feel the entire diner waiting. With a deep breath that felt like she was pulling air from the bottom of the ocean, she slowly lowered herself onto the wooden bench. It let out a familiar groan, a sound of protest from an old friend being woken from a long sleep. The vinyl was cracked and worn smooth in the spot where she used to sit for hours. As she settled onto the bench, something shifted inside her. The slump in her shoulders, the posture of a waitress carrying the weight of the world on her back, straightened. Her spine felt a little taller, her chin a little higher. She was no longer just a waitress in a diner. She was a musician at her instrument. Her hands, which had been trembling just moments ago, felt surprisingly steady as she lifted them and placed them on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth under her fingertips, a few of them chipped and yellowed with age, but still familiar. It was like shaking hands with her past. Her fingers, which knew the shape of coffee pots and plates, instinctively found their old positions. Her right thumb hovered over middle C, the home base, the starting point of 1,000 songs. The diner was so quiet she could hear the low hum of the ice machine in the kitchen, and the distant sound of a car horn from the street outside. She closed her eyes for just a second, blocking out the faces, the dare, the money. She tried to remember what it felt like to just play. Not for an audience, not for a grade, not for a competition, but for the sheer joy of it. She could feel Alistair's impatience radiating from across the room. He was waiting for the show to begin. She decided to give him one, but not the one he was expecting. Her fingers pressed down on the keys. The first few notes that came out were clumsy and discordant. A C sharp where a C should have been, a lagging rhythm that sounded like a child fumbling through their first lesson. A few snickers came from Alistair's table. She could practically feel his smirk widening. He thought he had one. He thought this was the catastrophe he had predicted. But Clara wasn't playing for him. She was just warming up, reacquainting herself with an old friend, feeling out its quirks and its voice. She was listening to the piano, remembering how the hammers struck the strings, how the pedals vibrated through the floor. She was letting the music wake up inside her, one small, imperfect note at a time. And then, after a moment of hesitation, her fingers stilled, and she began to play in earnest. The simple, clumsy melody vanished, replaced by something else entirely. Something that would change the atmosphere of the diner forever. The first few clumsy notes hung in the air like a question, and Alistair's friends let out a few snickers, just as expected. But Clara didn't flinch. She let those notes fade, a final farewell to the timid waitress who had walked to the piano. Then her fingers, which had been hesitant, found their confidence. They settled into a new position on the keys, and a different sound began to emerge. It was a single, clear note, soft and full, like a drop of rain falling into a still pond. It rippled through the silence of the diner, carrying with it a sense of calm and melancholy that immediately commanded attention. The snickers at Alistair's table stopped abruptly. A few heads, which had been turned away in polite disinterest, now turned back toward the corner. From that single note, a melody began to bloom. It was not a simple tune or a happy jingle. It was a complex weaving thread of sound that spoke of something deep and true. The notes flowed from her fingers, not one by one, but in graceful, interconnected phrases. It was as if she was telling a story without using any words, a story of quiet sadness and hopeful longing. The dusty old piano, which had been mocked just moments before, seemed to transform under her touch. The worn hammers struck the strings with a voice that was surprisingly rich and warm. The vibrations traveled through the wooden floor, up the legs of the tables, and into the bones of everyone listening. The greasy, familiar air of the diner felt different now, cleansed and made sacred by the music. Clara's eyes were closed, her head slightly bowed. She was no longer in the steaming cup. She was far away, lost in a world of her own creation. The ache in her back from hours of leaning over tables was gone. The tiredness in her soul had been replaced by a current of pure energy that flowed from her heart. Through her arms and out of her fingertips, her hands, which looked so ordinary when they were holding a coffee pot, now seemed to possess a magic of their own. They moved across the keys with a practiced elegance, her left hand playing a soft, steady rhythm while her right hand danced and soared, painting pictures in the air with sound across the room. Alistair's face was a canvas of changing emotions. The smirk had been the first thing to go, wiped away by the sheer beauty of the opening melody. Now his jaw was slowly starting to go slack. He leaned forward, his expensive suit suddenly feeling tight and uncomfortable. He had come here for a cheap laugh, to feel powerful and superior. But this was something he couldn't control, couldn't buy, and couldn't dismiss. This was real. He looked at the woman at the piano, the quiet waitress he had so easily mocked, and he didn't recognize her. Her posture, her expression, the very air around her was different. She was in command, and he was the one who felt small. His friends were frozen too, their forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide with a disbelief that mirrored his own. They glanced at each other, their silent communication asking the same question: where is this coming from? The music began to grow more complex. The soft, sad melody was joined by a series of rapid, intricate runs of notes that cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall. It was a display of technical skill that was breathtaking, but it wasn't just showing off. Every flurry of notes served the emotion of the piece, adding layers of tension and passion. The young couple in the booth who had been whispering to each other were now silent. The boy had his arm around the girl's shoulder. She was leaning her head against him, both of them completely lost in the world Clara was creating. Even the cook had poked his head out of the kitchen window, his face glistening with sweat. His usual grumpy expression replaced by one of pure wonder. The music swelled, growing louder and more powerful. The quiet sadness that had opened the piece was now a full-throated cry of emotion. The chords were bigger, fuller, resonating through the small diner like thunder in a distant valley. Clara's body swayed with the music, her movements becoming more pronounced as the intensity built. She wasn't just playing the notes anymore. She was conducting an orchestra of feelings, and the old piano was her willing accomplice. It was a sound that was both powerful and deeply personal, a sound that spoke of struggles and triumphs, of heartbreak and healing. It was the sound of a life lived, of pain that had been turned into something beautiful. In that moment, Clara wasn't just playing a song, she was playing her own story. She was playing the loneliness of her small apartment, the ache of missed opportunities, the quiet desperation of a dream that had been put on a shelf and forgotten. But she was also playing the resilience that had kept her going. The small moments of joy she found in a kind word from a customer or the taste of a hot cup of coffee on a cold day. She was playing the memory of her grandmother's patient hands on her own, teaching her that music wasn't about perfection, but about feeling. And for the first time in years, she was letting herself feel it all. The piece reached its climax. A storm of sound that was both chaotic and controlled. A whirlwind of emotions that left the listeners breathless. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The loud, powerful chords faded away, leaving behind a single, haunting melody that was even more poignant than the one that had opened the piece. It was a melody of acceptance, of quiet peace. The notes were softer now, spaced further apart, each one hanging in the air like a star in the night sky, before gently fading into silence. When the final note was gone, a profound silence settled over the diner. It was a different kind of silence than the one before. It wasn't a silence filled with tension or expectation. It was a sacred, reverent silence, the kind that follows a truly powerful shared experience. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, letting the echoes of the music vibrate within them. The air seemed to shimmer. Alistair was still leaning forward, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes fixed on Clara. The $500 lay forgotten on the table in front of him. A meaningless piece of paper in a world that had just been turned upside down. Clara sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, her head still bowed. The musician was gone, and the waitress was slowly returning, but something had changed forever. The silence stretched on, thick with emotion, a fragile bubble that no one dared to break. The silence that followed the last fading note was a living thing. It was not the quiet of an empty room, but the quiet of a room full of people holding their breath, afraid to shatter the fragile beauty that still lingered in the air like the scent of rain after a storm. The usual sounds of the diner, the hum of the refrigerator, the rattle of the ventilation fan, the distant traffic seemed to have packed their bags and left, giving the music the final, respectful word. For a long moment, no one moved. The young couple in the booth remained locked in their embrace. The cook stayed frozen in the kitchen window, and Alistair's friends sat like statues, their expensive meals growing cold in front of them. It was George who broke the spell. He was an old man, and his hands were a little shaky, but his clap was firm and clear. It was a single, sharp sound that cut through the stillness. Then another person joined in, a woman at a nearby table. And then the truck driver, by the window. It wasn't a wave of polite concert hall applause. It started slowly, awkwardly, like a few people waking from a dream. But then it grew. It built into a thunderous, heartfelt ovation that filled the small diner. A roar of appreciation that was for the music, for the emotion, and for the woman who had created it all. People were standing up, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. They were not just clapping for a performance. They were thanking Clara for giving them a moment of pure, unadulterated beauty in the middle of their ordinary day. Clara, however, did not look up. She seemed to shrink under the weight of their attention. The confident musician who had commanded the room with her music was gone, and in her place was the timid waitress, overwhelmed and exposed. The sound of the applause was not a reward. It was a spotlight that made her feel vulnerable and raw. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys as if they were burning hot and placed them in her lap. She stood up from the bench, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor. She wanted to disappear, to melt back into the background where she felt safe. She began to walk back toward the kitchen, trying to be invisible. But the crowd of people made a path for her, their applause following her every step. A loud scraping sound cut through the noise as Alistair pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. The applause from his table died instantly. He moved through the diner not with his usual arrogant swagger, but with a hesitant, almost reverent stride. He walked as if he were on holy ground, his eyes fixed only on Clara. The $500 was still in his hand, but he held it loosely now, as if he had forgotten it was there. He intercepted her before she could reach the safety of the counter, standing in her path. The diner fell silent again, everyone watching this new, unexpected confrontation. Clara finally had to look up. She expected to see a smirk, a condescending remark, a final twist of the knife. But his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated awe. His usual air of superiority had been completely stripped away, replaced by a humbled confusion. He looked like a man who had just discovered that the world was not at all what he thought it was. "That was," began, his voice uncharacteristically soft and a little unsteady. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words, but they seemed to have abandoned him. "That was incredible," he finally managed to say, the words sounding inadequate even to his own ears. I've never heard anything like that." He looked from her face to her hands and back again, as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "Where?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine, heart-deep curiosity. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara looked down at her hands. The same hands that had just created such magic and were now fidgeting with the edge of her apron. She felt a familiar lump in her throat, the one that appeared whenever she thought about her past. She didn't want to tell him. It was her story, her private pain. But looking at his face, at the complete transformation from arrogance to humility, she felt a strange urge to answer. She owed him, and the room, an explanation. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I had a scholarship," she said, her eyes still on the floor. "To a school? A music school in the city." She didn't say the name, but the weight behind the words was enough. Alistair's eyes widened slightly. He knew what that meant. It was the best of the best. "I was." "Good," she continued, a sad smile touching her lips. "For a long time, that's all I was. A girl who could play the piano. I practiced for hours, every day. I missed birthdays. I didn't go to parties. I didn't have friends. I just had the music, and it was enough. Or, I thought it was." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The diner was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. "Ah!" "It's like a monster that lives inside your head," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "Every note has to be perfect. Every performance has to be better than the last. You stop playing for joy and start playing to not fail. And then something happened, a loss. A big one." She didn't elaborate, and no one would have dared to ask. "And the music, which had always been my friend, suddenly felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. It was too heavy, so I ran. I left it all behind. I came here because this place is quiet. And the piano. It's just a piece of furniture. It can't hurt me here." Alistair listened to her story, his expression growing more somber with every word. He finally understood. He saw the gulf between his world of assumed value and hers of hidden depth. He saw the $500 in his hand, not as a prize, but as an insult. It was a symbol of the shallow world she had escaped, a world that tried to put a price on things that were priceless. With a slow, deliberate movement, he folded the bills and slid them back into his wallet. "Money is an insult," he said, his voice firm but filled with a newfound respect. "What I offered was a dare born of arrogance. What you deserve is an opportunity born of respect." He looked around the diner, at the faces still watching them, and then back at Clara. "I am a patron of the city's Philharmonic," he explained. "I have access to a small, private concert hall. It has a perfectly maintained Steinway grand piano." He pulled a business card from his wallet and a pen from his pocket. He scribbled a series of numbers on the back of the card. "This is the key code to the hall," he said, holding it out to her. "It's yours any night you want. No audience, no pressure. Just you and the music. If and when you're ever ready to play for people again, you let me know. But for now," he said, his voice softening, "just play for you." Clara looked down at the card in his hand, a simple piece of white paper with neat black printing. It didn't look like much, but it felt heavier than any amount of money. It was a key. Not just to a concert hall, but to a part of herself she had locked away years ago. For the first time in a long time, a tiny flicker of the old passion ignited in her eyes. She slowly reached out and took the card, her fingers brushing against his. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She simply held the key to her future, a future she thought she had lost forever. And in the quiet of the diner, a new song was just beginning to start. The weight of the small white card in Clara's hand felt immense, heavier than a tray full of dirty dishes. The diner was slowly coming back to life, the spell broken by the soft murmur of voices and the clinking of silverware. Alistair and his friends were gone. Their departure as quiet as their arrival had been loud, leaving behind a charged silence that was now being filled with whispered conversations. People looked at her differently now. It wasn't pity or curiosity, but a kind of quiet respect. They saw the waitress, but they also saw the musician. As she made her way back to the counter, George gave her a small, knowing nod. A silent acknowledgement that went deeper than words. She tucked the card into her apron pocket, right next to her order pad, and tried to go back to work. But her hands felt clumsy, and her mind was a million miles away. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She refilled coffee cups and cleared tables on autopilot, her body moving through the familiar motions while her heart and mind were still in the corner by the piano, replaying the music, the silence, and Alistair's transformed face. The world looked the same, the faded posters, the cracked booths, the greasy spoon on the counter, but it felt completely different. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and she was seeing everything, including herself, with new eyes. When her shift was over, she walked out into the cool night air, the city lights blurring as a wave of exhaustion and emotion washed over her. All she wanted was to go back to her small, quiet apartment and forget the day ever happened. But forgetting was impossible. Back in her apartment, the silence was not peaceful. It was loud and empty. She sat on the edge of her bed, the card in her hand. The numbers on the back seemed to glow in the dim light. A concert hall. A Steinway grand piano. The words echoed in her head, bringing with them a tidal wave of memories she had spent years trying to suppress. She remembered the cold, sterile practice rooms at the conservatory, the relentless pressure from her professors, the gnawing fear of not being good enough, the constant, suffocating feeling that her entire worth was tied to how perfectly she could play. She remembered the competitions, the way the judges would sit with their stern faces, their pens scratching on notepads, reducing her passion to a series of numbers. The music, which had once been her escape, had become her prison. The pain of her loss had been the final crushing blow, the one that made the prison walls collapse around her and she had run. Leaving the rubble behind her, she looked at the card, and a surge of anger rose up in her. Who was he to come into her life and stir all this up? He didn't know her. He didn't know the sleepless nights, the tears, the feeling of failure that had haunted her for years. He saw a 5-minute performance and thought he could fix her with a key. She stood up and walked over to the small trash can in the corner of her room. She held the card over it, her fingers trembling. It would be so easy to let it drop, to close this door before it was even fully opened, to go back to the quiet, predictable safety of her life as a waitress, but she couldn't. Her hand wouldn't let go. because underneath the anger and the fear, there was something else. A tiny, flickering spark. She remembered the way the music had felt today in the diner. It hadn't been about perfection or pressure. It had been raw and real. For the first time in a long time, she had played for herself, not for an audience or a grade. She had let the pain and the joy pour out of her, and for a few precious minutes, she had been free. She thought of her grandmother, not the stern-faced judges or the demanding professors. She remembered sitting on this very piano bench as a little girl, her grandmother beside her, her voice soft and encouraging. "Feel the music, sweetie. Let it tell you a story. It doesn't have to be a perfect story, just a true one." That memory was the key. Not the piece of plastic in her hand, but the memory of why she had fallen in love with the piano in the first place. It wasn't for the applause or the approval. It was for the feeling of creating something beautiful out of silence, of speaking a language that words couldn't capture. With a deep, shaky breath, Clara put the card back on her nightstand. She wouldn't throw it away, but she wasn't ready to use it either. Not yet. A few days went by. Life at the diner returned to its normal rhythm, but Clara was different. She moved with a new, quiet confidence. She smiled more, and her smiles reached her eyes. She found herself humming old melodies as she wiped down the tables. The old piano in the corner no longer seemed like a ghost from her past. It just looked like an old, dusty piano. One evening, a week after the dare, she found herself standing in front of it after her shift. The diner was empty, the chairs upturned on the tables. She ran her hand over the keys, then sat down on the bench. She didn't play a masterpiece. She just played a simple scale, then a simple melody she remembered from her childhood. The notes were a little rusty, the piano was out of tune, but it didn't matter. It felt like coming home that night, back in her apartment. She picked up the card. The numbers didn't seem so intimidating anymore. She decided she would go. Not because Alistair had offered, and not because she owed it to anyone. She was going for herself. She was going for the little girl who loved music more than anything. She put on a simple dress, the nicest one she owned, and took a bus to the address printed on the front of the card. The concert hall was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't a big, imposing building, but a smaller, more intimate space. Using the code, she let herself in through a side door. The air inside was cool and smelled of polished wood and old velvet. The hall was dark and empty, bathed in the soft glow of emergency lights. And there, in the center of the stage, under a single spotlight, was the piano. It was a magnificent, gleaming black Steinway, its lid propped open like a giant welcoming wing. It looked perfect, and it looked terrifying. She walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. She climbed the 3 steps onto the stage and approached the piano as if it were a sleeping animal. She ran a hand over its smooth, cool surface, then lifted the lid to reveal the pristine white and black keys. They were perfect, unblemished, waiting. She sat down on the padded bench, which was soft and yielding. She felt a tremor of the old fear, the ghost of the pressure, but she took a deep breath and pushed it away. She was not here to perform. She was just here to visit an old friend. Her fingers hovered over the keys, then descended. The first note that rang out was clear and pure, a sound so beautiful it made her catch her breath. It was a world away from the dusty, honky-tonk sound of the diner piano. She began to play, not a complex concerto or a dramatic sonata, but the simple melody her grandmother had taught her, the one she had played at the diner a few nights before. She played it slowly, letting each note hang in the air. She wasn't thinking about technique or perfection. She was just thinking about the feeling, the story. As she played, the tension in her shoulders began to melt away. The music flowed through her, a current of pure emotion. She wasn't the scared student or the heartbroken young woman. She wasn't even the waitress. She was just Clara, and she was playing the piano. Tears began to stream down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of cleansing, of coming home to herself after being lost for so long. She played until her fingers ached, not for an imaginary audience, but for the empty hall. For the memory of her grandmother, and for the part of herself she thought she had lost forever. When she finally finished, The last note faded into a profound, peaceful silence. She sat there for a long time, her hands resting on the keys, a small, genuine smile on her face. She didn't know what the future held. Maybe she would play again, maybe she wouldn't. But for the first time in years, it was her choice. The key hadn't unlocked a career or a new life. It had unlocked a door inside her own heart, and she had finally walked through it.